All right, guys. So, picking up where we left off, the big event of 1941 for America is in December, right? And so right away, Americans expect, and I think rightfully so, that we should seek vengeance on Japan. We want revenge. We're angry, as we should be. And, the idea that this nation, this empire, this dastardly attack, keep in mind, as I told you guys the other day, Japan was in the middle of negotiating with us when this attack happened. So it's like they were literally talking like, how do we make things better with you right as they bombed us? And that's just not cool. And so Americans were really, really outraged. And you might argue that the average American said, let's get Japan first. But that was not our strategy. We had, interestingly enough, worked out an agreement prior to this. And I put here Churchill and FDR, but really it was the British and American military staff who had worked this out. It's called ABC, which stands for America, Britain, and Canada. ABC One agreement. And what they had basically done as early as, I want to say it was it started in January of 41 and ran into like March. So again, this is sort of interesting to me, like the Atlantic Conference. Here you have these meetings where we're saying, okay, when we get into World War II, this is what we're going to do. So, this said that they would make all effort to stop Hitler's expansion and to start pressing his periphery out of where he already was. So even though our strategy had been defined already and we were attacked by the Japanese, this is what the U.S. military went for. So we're going to go with a get Hitler first strategy, which surprised some Americans. But when I say that, the irony is our first major battle against any of the Axis powers is going to be against the Japanese. So we're planning, our heaviest war planning is against Germany, but in reality, we're also going to have to plan on how to fight the Japanese. So the problem is we had slowly started preparing for military production, but we had not geared ourselves up for full wartime production. You remember the military was less than 200,000 people. The weapons and munitions that we were creating were for the Europeans under cash and carry, under Lend-Lease. And so now we're going to have to prepare for an extraordinarily difficult, what we would call logistical challenge. Logistics, that's Logistic, logistic, meaning how to get things from point A to point B. How many of the things do we have? How many do they need? And then the problem is in this scenario, point A and point B are a lot farther apart than London or Paris. We're not just getting to Western Europe, which we've been doing all along. Now we have to get to Burma and Australia and Algeria, places that are far removed from the normal American transportation network. And we're going to have to feed and arm and get ourselves there and provide for the allies too, including the Brits and the Russians. So this is a far heavier and greater challenge than World War I was in terms of logistical nightmare. And one of the guys who's really, really skilled at this is a fellow named George Marshall. So that's one of the reasons why he's going to be put in charge of the Army, is that he had done this in World War I. He was a logistical planner for how to deploy Americans in France. Well, now he's going to have a bigger challenge. And when it comes to the military. Now, the thing about World War I, if you recall, there were things like victory cabbage for sauerkraut, right? And, hot dogs for frankfurters. So there's this whole sort of ethnic animosity towards groups of Americans during World War I. Well, World War II, not as big a problem. Keep in mind, by World War II, we had been 20 years almost now without immigrants coming in. You guys may recall the immigration policy of the 20s, right? And so that had cut out, quote, new immigrants. So by this time, the Italians and the Germans and the Eastern Europeans had fully integrated into American society. And so you're not going to have the whole ethnic issue of, communities being attacked for their ethnicity, with one exception. And it is a glaringly obvious exception. And I'm going to point this out to you guys. A lot of times, the thing that's frustrating about a course that offers on World War II is I can't even begin to cover remotely all the interesting stories of World War II. It's such a big event in history, right? And this event alone, which is the taking of people of Japanese American ancestry, right? Evacuating them from the West Coast where they were seen as a potential security risk, and then putting them in concentration camps. Now, the problem with using the language concentration camp is that a lot of people hear that and they think Nazis in World War II, Holocaust. That's not this. These were places with schools, and they weren't like death camps by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, they were forcibly removing people under an executive order. So the president of the United States, and I told you, FDR makes more executive orders than any other president in history, right? He is going to order the evacuation, that's the language, of the West Coast. So particularly California, but also Oregon and the state of Washington. There are about, at that time, it's about 100,000 plus Japanese American ancestry people. These were called the Nisei, the new people of Japanese descent. One of the mistakes you'll hear students say is these were Japanese. Well, they weren't Japanese any more than I'm French, right? But they were of Japanese heredity, Japanese ancestry. And in some cases, they were one generation removed, meaning their parents were immigrants to America. So these were recently migrated Japanese Americans, families. And they were taken and put in these camps for the rest of the war. And the reason primarily was because they were thought to be saboteurs. So that means people who would engage in sabotage, right? People who would blow stuff up, airfields and things like that. But I went back and I read, because there were two cases, the ultimate big case that would take this challenge all the way to the Supreme Court, because it's very clear to me that this is a gross violation of these people's civil rights. Let's drop the Japanese part off of it and just say these were Americans. Right, American citizens who had all the guarantees of the Fifth and 14th Amendment. Right, you should not be incarcerated simply because of your ethnicity. So the case goes. You have an individual named Fred Korematsu. Fred does not want to leave his house. He lives in his house, and he's like, I don't want to leave. And you shouldn't be able to compel me to leave. And so they do. They force him to relocate, and he sues. And the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's a divided decision, 6-3. And there's quite a bit of dissension amongst the three towards the ruling. But I wrote down what Justice Frankfurter said, is that this was a martial, that means military necessity, from the danger of espionage and sabotage. So the president did not exceed his authority under the commander-in-chief, being under Article 2, by ordering this, the court said. Well, that was a shock to civil libertarians, but Americans didn't hardly bat an eye. Afterwards, by the way, folks, if you read the whole story, the United States will later apologize to these folks and give them $20,000 in reparations, which was a sizable amount of money after World War II. And if you not understand why, think about what happens to these people. They don't have jobs when they're in camps. They can't pay their mortgage. They can't pay for their farm. They can't run their business. So their farms and businesses go out of business during this period. And so this is a very unfortunate moment in history, but it is upheld by the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. So I would be aware that there was one glaring exception to no ethnic problem. By the way, this ends, it's pretty ugly because these folks are going to do very, very well as soldiers, for example, during World War II. Japanese Americans are going to serve with distinction and honor. And here you see life kind of continued in the camps, as normal as they could be, school and Boy Scouts and stuff. But in reality, these were people here held against their own wishes. Okay. All right. Now, one of the questions about the New Deal that is often, forgotten is when did it end? Sort of like what happened to the New Deal? And it formally ends in 1942. Virtually every federal agency that's not long-term reform, that were short-term relief, are stopped. So no more CCC, no more WPA. All of those relief unemployment agencies are closed because you're going to have what's called full employment during World War II. And it ended very quickly. There will also be no major attempt there is a minor attempt by the FDR administration to sort of promote why we're fighting World War II. Most notably, a series of movies called Why We Fight, which was pretty well made, Frank Capra. But not nearly the scale and effort of propaganda that you had in World War I. World War I, you may recall the Creel Committee, right? I mean, and they're the ones that sold the war so well that people were unhappy when the war didn't end the way they wanted. Okay, so very little. I'm not going to say there was none. I mean, they did use movies. some. They definitely had some music. You know, there were very enthusiastic support of the bond drives. That's where you saw a lot of posters and stuff still, again, the bond drives during World War II. But nowhere on the scale of what World War I sort of needed. We didn't need to be convinced to fight World War II. In fact, I read the survey in the book. They said 9 out of 10 Americans had no idea what the Atlantic Conference was or what its goals were. Like, this was not something, like, unlike Wilson's 14 points, which everybody heard of, nobody cared about the Atlantic Conference because we didn't need to be convinced to fight. They attacked us. And they attacked us in such a way that we were angry. I forgot to mention one thing. I really am embarrassed that I forgot it. I think I forgot, but anyway, the commander of the Japanese fleet who planned the attack on December 7th, his name was Yamamoto, right? And what Yamamoto said, particularly after the discovery that the aircraft carriers weren't there, right, is he said, "I fear we have wakened a sleeping giant." And by that, he was saying, and it was very clear he was right, that America is a massive force, capable of enormous power. 4th largest country in the world, 4th most populated country in the world, and we're just chilling, right? You know, at the time we had a military, you know, smaller than Chile, and so he's coming, and he realizes that by not knocking us out, all they had done was woke us up, and he wasn't wrong. And what really got woken during this period is the U.S. economy. We're going to focus our economy fully on kicking the Japanese down, right, and on the Germans. Like, that's all we're going to be about. And so it is an absolute astonishing turnaround in sort of what a country's doing. I mentioned the Atlantic Charter. Keep in mind, this was something that Roosevelt and Churchill had signed before Pearl Harbor, right? They had worked this out in Canada. So we have the ABC-1 agreement in 41, you know, January through March. And now in the summer of 41, we have the Atlantic Conference. So it becomes pretty clear that FDR expects we're going to be in war, and whose side we're definitely going to be on is the Brits, right? Like, that's, both of these agreements have said that we're going to be the British friends, right? So that is not something the ordinary American remembered, but it's something we certainly had heard of. Okay, so let's talk about, and again, this is a massive change from World War I. So you put a star beside this, a huge change between World War I and World War II. You just recall that World War I was run almost entirely by volunteerism. Okay, so the agency that you have to know up here is called the War Production Board, WPB. And the WPB, for all intents and purposes, became a form of socialism. And nobody blinked an eye when we needed it, because what it's going to do is launch a ship every 2 weeks, create billions of bullets, millions and millions of guns, tanks and planes. So it took control of the nation's economy, and under Kaiser, that was the guy's name, ironically, under Director Kaiser, they ordered the halting of non-essential products. So, you know, I always joke with my students about working on my car. I got a 1943 Chevy, right? There's no such thing as a 1943 Chevy. You couldn't buy a civilian automobile in 1943 or 1942 because they halted the manufacture of automobiles. They froze the domestic sale of tires, so you could get tires. They limited the amount of petroleum people bought. The War Production Board basically takes control over the entire economy and says, this factory is going to produce X amount of, well, here's a good example. Before this period in history, women wore stockings routinely, silk stockings, right? Nylon stockings. After this, they cannot wear them because they're not available anymore. All that silk and nylon is being used to make parachutes. So no more, you know, pantyhose, so to speak. It was a very different period. You know, you actually went from having the inability to buy stuff to the inability to buy stuff because there was no stuff available. Before, if you wanted to buy a car, you couldn't have afforded it because you were unemployed, right? Or you didn't have any money. Now you're going to have all this money and you can't buy a car. So it's like the whole economy inverted. And now everybody's got money, right? And nobody could buy anything. And what you're seeing up here on the right is really amazing. Those are price ceilings. So if you, and these are not voluntary. This is no NRA here. You know, this is how much a slice of apple pie costs. under the OPA, under the Office of Price Administration. This is how much a cup of coffee costs. So the government regulated everything. They set price controls, right? They also created, and you should know this agency as well, a war labor board. And the NWLB, the National War Labor Board, said this is how much wages are going to be. Because if you're doing the math here, you probably can figure out these guys are going to sell out pretty quickly, right? So that means what normally happens during wartime is what problem? Inflation, right? And so the government is going to take control of the economy and say there will be no more inflation and there will be no wage increases. So you're not going to get paid, you're not going to get more money, and you're not going to be able to spend it on anything. So as you might imagine, workers, well, what might you imagine? And you would think workers would not like it, but by and large, there is only one group who strike at all during all World War II. Very, very few worker protests. So in other words, what they hear from government agents is frequently, when the war is over, you will have a chance to make up for this sacrifice. So if you go back and look at World War II, World War I was about voluntary sacrifice, but World War II was about compulsory sacrifice. You didn't have a choice. These things that you're looking at here, and I was hoping to show you guys some of these. These are rations. Rations. These are the kind of things that would be a ticket that you would have a certain number a week or a month. Here's, these say coffee. Right here, the little ticket up here at the top, right? Most of these say spare because that's all they had left. But these were, you would, when you went to the store, if you didn't have a ration ticket, you could not buy flour. You couldn't buy sugar. And some people engaged in like the black market, but most people didn't because they knew that sugar and that flour was going to serve the U.S. forces, right? It was for the war effort. Everything was for the war effort. So people sacrificed and it worked. Okay, this worked during World War II. Like obviously, this was a sacrificial period. Okay, so I would like you to know that the War Labor Board was designed to keep wages from skyrocketing. Because now employees' labor is in shortage, right? So we go from having about 12% unemployment in 1940 to 0% unemployment by 1942, right? So the Depression is over. And so whatever you guys, I think, understand, what happens when you have full employment is there's intense pressure on wages to be paid more. And so that's why the National War Labor Board said, we're gonna cap wages. So prices had ceilings, right? The OPA, you couldn't pay more than X, but you weren't gonna get paid more than X either. And only one union went on strike during this period. And it was a member of the CIO, led by its founder, the head of the United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis. So Lewis felt like this was the perfect time to demand greater wages. The government's response was, nope, this is not the perfect time. The government will seize the industry if you try to block it. So we'll send troops in, to force the government. The government will force the company to operate, meaning the laborers won't be able to stop it. So no striking during this period. The Anti-Strike Act said you go to jail. That's not work or fight, which was what happened in World War I, but it's work or go to jail if you protest. So I would be aware of Lewis again. Here is this really big time labor leader who felt like it's not that he was anti-World War II or anti-FDR per se. He just felt like every time that labor had the opportunity to make more money, the government kept telling them, well, no, it's not a good time, particularly for coal miners, which were probably the hardest of labor in America, maybe them and steel workers. Okay, we'll definitely be familiar with those two. Now, another huge difference between World War II and World War I, first of all, keep in mind, in World War II, we start the draft in peacetime, right? And today, by the way, I double checked my numbers. Today, we have 100,000 less than this number. So I'm going to change that. I have about 1.3 million people in the active duty military. That's discounting the reserves. That's another 500,000 or so in reserves. But in World War II, we had 15 million people in uniform in the military, including 250,000 women. Today, that number, total military, is about 1.2 million. And so you get 10 times as many people in World War II, over 10 times. But one of the things I want you to know about these ladies is they are going to serve in important roles in the military itself. So this is actually women in the military. So think sergeants and corporals. And they played a vital role as what are called auxiliary. So the WACs were the Army auxiliary, the WAIs were the Navy, the SPARs were the Air Force, so or the Air Corps. So you had these ladies, the women who would be soldiers in the military, and they would drive trucks, for example, or fly planes, or do all kinds of things that were needed as military jobs. And some of these women got shot at, their planes were shot, and so a very active role and the sort of support role, meaning things that men did, but they could do instead of it, and that was important. We are also going to have to import guest workers. And so we're going to start what's called the Bracero program, which is to actually bring in Mexicans specifically for the role of agricultural workers. So like fruit picking and things like that. So if you think about those Okies, I told you they got jobs in California industries in the defense business, right? And of course, the unfortunate thing is that there is going to be, during and after the war, an enormous amount of hostility and discrimination to these Hispanics. These Mexican folks are going to get a lot of, they're going to play a vital role, but they're going to be, facing a lot of discrimination later. Perhaps the most iconic image of women in the workplace in World War II is Rosie the Riveter. This is that poster, very historic image. And Rosie the Riveter represents one of the 6 million women who went to work. Now think about how big a number that is in government factories. Riveting is taking an air gun, which imagine like a giant drill or a giant I don't know if you've ever seen like tires being changed on a NASCAR car, those big air guns. They're kind of like that, and they drive it's about that big bolt into the side of steel plates. So you had to be a strong person in order to be a riveter. And I love the poster. The poster is a brilliant piece of advertisement / propaganda here, and that is the lady is depicted attractively. She's pretty in the face, right? She is an attractive woman, and she's got her guns on display, so to speak. Like you got her big arm out, flexing, and so the idea is that you can be both feminine and a factory worker. Because before that, it's kind of not really the image of a factory worker. So Rosie is both a woman and a strong person, and that really became honestly an iconic symbol. The thing about World War II that's interesting, though, is that almost 2/3 of these ladies, are not going to stay in these businesses. But when the war ends, women are going to come home, and most of them are not going to demand to continue in those jobs. And they're going to go to work being the moms of the largest generation in American history, which is the baby boom. But 1/3 of these women, so that you can do the math, that's 2 million women continue to work after World War II. And so that's a big change in the American society. So what about our soldiers, sailors, Marines? I said 15 million. We had a draft, right? We had lots of volunteers after Pearl Harbor, but we'd already had a lot of people because of the draft. And again, there's that very famous, iconic image of Uncle Sam. And I would point out that this stuff right here wasn't heavily promoted. Like a lot of times you would see these posters at the workplace. Like, why are you riveting? And this is a rivet gun right here. You're riveting by help. You're fighting Germany by building battleships here or by building tanks here. This is your way of service. So as an employee in the American workforce, you are part of the victory. And every historian I've ever read says the #1 reason for America winning World War II is our economy, our industry, our factories, our manufacturing, our ability to produce so much more than the Nazis could dream of. You understand? Now, of course, we had great military leaders. We had good luck at times. They had some major mistakes, but at the end of the day, no one on the planet could beat this giant. Okay, and that's pretty awesome. So here you see Rosie in several different formats. She's drilling here. She's got a rivet gun in her lap while she takes her lunch. Lots of Rosies. Nursing industry explodes. Huge demand for nurses. These are posters from these various groups. This is a WWII, this lady right here. waves, which were the Navy down here. And you can see, by the way, some of these folks would go into the American Computing Service, which was part of the military service, and will help lay the foundation for the computer industry, you know, women in computing. Now, I haven't mentioned this event much in the past, but we definitely want to focus on it more now. I mentioned during World War I, but it explodes in World War II, all right? And that is the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is the period in American history when African Americans relocated from the Deep South, a huge number, all right, to industrial cities around America, particularly in the Northeast, but also in the West. So the Great Migration is ironic to me because during World War II, FDR, with the support of his Democratic senators, is going to put a lot of military industry in the South, right as African Americans are leaving the South looking for jobs. So, you know, there are going to be a lot of factories that produce ships in places like Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana. There are going to be textile factories in Virginia and North Carolina. So a lot of big industries are going to locate southward while blacks are moving northward. But perhaps even just as influential, you're going to have the development of a machine cotton picker, a machine that actually harvests the cotton without having to do it by hand, which is what a great number of sharecroppers have done for half a century. So what's going to happen then is 5 million more people are going to migrate with the 1 million plus African Americans during this period. So, before it was kind of a slow trickle during the 19-teens and 20s. Now it's a flood. 6 million plus African Americans are going to migrate to places like Harlem and to Chicago and to Detroit and to Seattle. So you're going to have a lot more African American migration. Here you can see it depicted in a family sort of on the road looking for a work industry or work business. Work industries were segregated, although many of the industries' facilities had black and white employees. Banner Mills had black and white employees, for example. Okay, now what about race during the war itself? And so I made sort of a slide here just for the issue of race. Okay, and so the last time we were talking about African American groups much, we were talking about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois had founded a group called the NAACP. I mentioned that group particularly again during the 1920s with lynching, right, against the lynching in that period. Also, you had the terrible race riots against blacks in the 20s. But I haven't mentioned this fella yet, and he is going to be very influential. In fact, this man is going to be the guy who walks side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. Okay, and his name is A. Philip Randolph. So just Philip Randolph's fine, or Randolph if you want, but A. Philip Randolph was the leader of a union. And the union was called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Now, porters are the people who, like, I carried your luggage or brought food to you. And so basically the guys that were like, you know, domestic servants, so to speak, on the train. I mean, that was their job. And it was a good job, and it paid pretty well at the time for African Americans. It was segregated, but this was work black people could do. And he believed correctly that all of these brand new industries in defense were not going to benefit black people, right? And so he threatened, amidst the war, a giant Negro march on Washington. And so Philip Randolph was definitely known by future civil rights leaders. Well, to kind of steer away this criticism, FDR said, okay, let's create an agency, which still exists to this day, called the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And the thing about it is that the president can't tell, at this time in history, couldn't tell a private business it couldn't segregate. But if they had a defense contract, he could. So every company that had defense contracts could not segregate, could not prohibit blacks from working there. And I shouldn't have to remind you guys, the almost entire nation's economy was a defense industry during World War II. So this was a big boon, gain for African Americans as far as early civil rights. Another key development is what I sometimes call the militarization or the sort of radicalism of the post-World War African American movement, which was they were really furious about in World War One fighting against tyranny and then coming home and being victimized by it. And now in World War II, they were fighting against tyranny, and some of them are going to have to come home to racism and the tyranny of that problem. So that's where they get this slogan, double V, a victory over the dictators, or a victory over fascists, and a victory over racism. You have a new group created. Now, the NAACP is the historic group, but keep in mind, NAACP's strategy historically has been in the courts and through law. So you have a group that is much more interested in marches and protests and holding up signs, and they're called the Congress of Racial Equality, a much more active, in the public, active civil rights group. So these are two groups that will really do very well during this period. Now, another group that comes out of the shadows, so to speak, and I'd already mentioned to you that FDR got a New Deal for the Native Americans, right? The Indian New Deal, so to speak. And Native Americans are going to create a very vital role in World War II. And it is one of the neatest stories. So particularly in the Southwest, the Zuni and the Navajo, so we'll focus most on the Navajo, you had, particularly the Marines, a major problem. So if you know anything about World War II, communications are through radio, right? But the problem is that anyone can intercept those communications. You could intercept those communications because of the radio signal. So what they need is a code that can be broadcast in the open and not decipherable. Like a secret code that you would hear and not know what the heck they were talking about, right? So what these Marines did is they came up with, using the Navajo language, code. So if you look at a tank, it has a sort of shape that a Native American might recognize. It looks like a turtle. So they would call a tank the Navajo word for turtle. And so these guys would be stationed on land, and they would radio operate to the warships out in the sea, and they would say, there is a tank at the following coordinates, only they would say it in Navajo, right? So the Japanese would hear them, and they're like, I don't understand what they're saying. One transcript of the Japanese said it sounded like they were underwater, right? They didn't understand because the Navajo were talking to another Navajo on the ship in code in Navajo, and no one on the planet spoke Navajo but the Navajo, right? So this was having an unbreakable code that the Japanese never figured out. And so we could, at battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we use these guys, these code talkers, they're called. They're sometimes called wind talkers because it was really fascinating stuff to hear these guys using Indian words for tanks and planes and aircraft carriers or whatever. Now, the other thing I mentioned is, it's in the book, the folks that were newly arrived in America to work as Hispanics had always looked up at America as sort of the American dream, right? These were people who are like, yeah, I'm in America now, I can work. So what they began to do was they would buy these suits, which were sort of outlandish. If you look at them, they were oversized. And these are known in history as zoot suits, okay? These sort of large, baggy suits that these Mexicans would wear. And African Americans wore them too, because they were relatively cheap, but they were a suit. Well, Americans who were not Hispanic resented these people and beat the living tar out of them. You had sort of riots against them. And they didn't like having Mexicans in their neighborhoods and stuff like that. So I told you that it wasn't common to have ethnic conflict during World War II, and it wasn't. But for these folks, they were a victim of discrimination, being targeted because of who they were and how they looked. And, that's part of our country's history. Okay. So here you can see some Navajo code talkers or wind talkers. True story, the Marines would have with the code talker another Marine whose job it was to not let the code talker be captured. He was like the bodyguard of the code talker. But if the code talker was going to be captured, he was also the guy who was supposed to terminate the code talker. In other words, under no circumstances were these guys supposed to be captured. You understand? That was a heavy, heavy burden to be. There's elite special narrative. The Navajo code talkers. And then I mentioned African Americans on the home front, but there's an enormous amount of narratives about African Americans on the war front. So during World War II, blacks were segregated in the military. So there were black units and white units. And Black units particularly are going to serve well in the Air Force or in the Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force at this point in history. And the most famous group of all was the 332nd Fighter Group's 99th Pursuit Squadron. You don't have to remember all of that, but what I would like you to know them as the Tuskegee Airmen. Okay, the title up at the top, the Tuskegee Airmen, or sometimes they're called Red Tails because they would paint the tail of their P-51 red, right? And they were an all-black flying unit. Okay, now the reason they were at Tuskegee is no one really wanted to let them have an air base. And these guys set out to prove that they were capable of not only being military personnel, but being pilots, which are highly recognized as, you know, sophisticated and kind of the cool guys. So they're going to go to Europe, and they're going to serve in Italy primarily, but throughout Europe. And they're going to get what are called DFCs. That's an enormous, prestigious accommodation. They get 95 of these, and they are the most successful fighter escort unit of the entire war. So these are the fighters that fly with the bombers, right? And so the Tuskegee Airmen are magnificent soldiers and do a really brilliant job in spite of dealing with segregation in the military itself. A couple great movies made about this unit particularly. Here you can see units in the Army that were segregated. So segregation was common. I mentioned Japanese Americans. The irony of what happened to Japanese Americans in the war is not only were they segregated into camps, but they were allowed to serve in the military. Now, they could not serve in the Pacific Theater. Like, that was against military rules. Like, there was this fear that Japanese Americans would not fight the Japanese. All right, but they were primarily in Italy. And here you can see they had an infantry battalion made up of Japanese Americans. And they were called Nisei. Nisei is the Japanese word for new. Issei is old. So these are like new Americans. Okay. And they had 21 Medal of Honor recipients in their service. So I point these out to show you that these were not isolated individuals, but entire units made up of people who are often marginalized here in America, fighting for America, right? They're fighting for a country that's putting some of their family in camps. They're fighting for their country, you know, and I think that's just one of the most beautiful stories. You know, like, here are people who were fighting for their nation, even though their nation didn't always treat them well. So really, really decorated unit. This fella was one of our longest serving U.S. senators. He lost an arm in World War II. His name is Daniel, Inouye. And Senator Inouye just passed away a couple of years back, but he was highly decorated, and you can see he gave his arm to his country, to our country. Okay, so be aware of these units, and I point all this out because obviously the vast majority of the armed forces were white people from all across America, and their stories are fascinating. But keep in mind that many different groups within America were represented in the war effort. Okay, so let's move on to how America fundamentally changes because of World War II. All right. So as I mentioned before, this absolutely crushes the Great Depression, right? If you measure the Great Depression by unemployment, well, there's no more unemployment, all right, at all. If you measure sort of the spending of the Great Depression, keep in mind, like, all of the Great Depression spending was about $20 billion, right? All of World War II is $200 billion. So enormous expenditures. It made America a rich nation. Now, I know that sounds weird, but if wealth is simply what the government is creating and distributing it to the populace, the country emerges out of World War II richer than we started World War II. People make more money and are wealthier, and America is the only major economic power in the world after World War II. So it's a remarkable transformation from 39 to 45, right? Enormous changes that we were already used to major changes. You understand? I mean, we've been through some major changes in our under the Great Depression. We've seen huge changes. Well, this is going to be even further. Americans have never been rationed by the federal government. Now, 70% of all GDP is focused on war production during the war. It's an enormous amount. Defense industry jobs. Tons and tons of people in America are going to go to work for the federal government through a business that creates stuff for the defense industry. More oversight over businesses than before. So guys, if the New Deal put government in your life, World War II made it permanent, right? Like it was 1-2 punch of government everything. And so after this, we were fundamentally used to, that New Deal cost $50 billion at the long-term cost of the deal. I should 20 billion in the short term, 50 in the long term. Thank you, Social Security and all that good stuff. Right, but nonetheless, I do want to focus on the phrase military-industrial complex. That term itself is going to come from a future president named Dwight D. Eisenhower when he's president. But what it is today a very alarming stat, I think, like because we're not fighting World War II anymore, right? Did I tell you guys what percentage of GDP America is government creation today? Have I told you guys that? What amount of the U.S. government, what amount of GDP is created by the U.S. government? You guys at home know? I thought I told this class. Well, what I mean by that is normally when we measure GDP, we're measuring how much Goodyear makes, right? So it looks like currently it's about 33%. Okay, so about a third of the entire GDP of the country is federal spending right now. So what that means is the government is employing people somehow, and it usually means in the case of our country, employing them in a defense industry, right? Like that's where most people who have a job connected to the government is, and so that it becomes an alarming tradition during the Cold War. Like it made sense for us to be producing all that stuff during World War II, right? But during the Cold War, we're going to do it even more. So we're going to become dependent on having jobs that are part of the creation of the government. Like one of Goodyear's major customers is the government, and it's for airplane tires on, aircraft that are military in nature. So if the government stops creating airplanes for the military use, then that means Goodyear has to lay off people. If the government stops making nuclear submarines, then Babcock and Wilcox stop working. So we become accustomed to what's called military spending, right, or defense spending. And I give a couple examples with a joke beside it. It'll be a great day when our schools get all the money they need. The Air Force has all the bake sale to buy a bomb, right? Like you guys ever had to raise money for education? You've never been a part of a fundraiser for something for schools? Yeah, in our country, the students raise money from their families to pay for schools, right? But we don't do that to build bombers. Keep in mind, I've shown you guys airplane graveyard, right? A lot of bombers that are sitting in empty fields right now. But that was somebody's job, even if it was a completely useless piece of equipment, like many of these are. So I do wonder if that price is worth it. Now, in World War II, it was worth it. We're going to spend $330 billion in the course of World War II on debt and everything, right? Your generation is still going to pay for World War II. We have never gotten rid of this debt. So we're still paying a war, but we won. And some people would say that's a price we're paying. We aren't under a Nazi regime. So it's a great debate about what should we be doing as far as government spending in terms of military. How big is too big? That's a debate we should have as a people. Now, how do we pay for the war? We borrow money. I told you we're still paying for it, right? We're going to borrow $330 billion, 60% of that from ourselves. So remember I told you people didn't have anything to spend their money on? Guess what? Yes, they did. They could buy a bond. So what happened is people got paid and then they loaned the money to the government. And what's ironic is they were probably getting paid by the government, like through some form or fashion. So, but it's loaning it from future generations. And y'all are the future generation. I'm the future generation. We're still paying on that debt. And again, I'm okay paying the debt on World War II. I'm not necessarily okay on paying the debt for a tax cut for Mark Zuckerberg. Right? There's a big difference between those two things for me. So nonetheless, a massive amount of debt is the product of World War II, as well as victory. So if you do the math, the year America enters World War II, Pearl Harbor was December, right? Which means by and large, we were not in World War II in 1941. So let's do the year 1942. Well, if you look at a map in 1942, the bad guys are winning. All right, the bad guys have taken over North Africa, Axis powers. They've taken over all of Europe with the exception of the Soviet Union and Britain. They have taken over all of East Asia and are on their way to taking Australia, right? Keep in mind, when the Italians had Libya, the Axis powers are pressing toward Turkey. They're about to take over the Middle East, right? And if they take over the Middle East, that's the world's oil supply. And by the way, if you're pretty close to Burma, you might be aware that there's this place called India. Right? So it looked like the Axis powers might take over the rest of the world. That's some scary stuff, right? So I mentioned that our strategy was to get Hitler first, but I told you the irony is that our first major battles are against the Japanese. So even though our major effort is focused on getting to Europe, we're going to actually start fighting the war in the Pacific. Okay, so let's go to our battles. All right. Now, Japan has not only knocked out Pearl Harbor, at least for a short time, they seize and capture every major American installation in the Pacific. Most significantly, the Philippines. The Philippines put up an enormous struggle to not be, taken. Our troops on the Philippines do a brilliant job of fighting, but they just are cut off. We have had to accept that they are out of reach. Okay, so when you look here, they took over Guam, American territory, right? Wake, which is another Pacific territory. Hong Kong, which is a British territory. British Malaya, which is Malaysia. And Burma, which is, if you haven't been keeping up with news lately, just had a coup d'etat over there last month. And then they also have a problem, we do, of being isolated or cut off from China. So China has a nationalist leader who's our ally. He is actually, the Chinese nationalists are part of the Allies in World War II, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese had a tough story. They're in the middle of the civil war in China. And it stopped, because they had a common enemy, the Japanese. So the Japanese have invaded China, and we are going to help the Chinese fight back against the Japanese, we being the US. The problem is the only way we can get to them is from India. And India is a long ways from China. I don't know if you guys know about geography or not, but those are two really big countries. So I remember talking to my wife's great aunt, who was a WWII, one of those women's auxiliary pilots. And she flew supply planes over the hump. It's a really cool story. She and her friends were part of a unit that were large supply planes that would fly out of northern India, which was British controlled territory, right? Northern India, right here. They would fly over Tibet, right? Which was the Himalayas. That's the hump. You had to get all, and then they would come down in mainland China and deposit their supplies for the nationalists, and they'd get shot at. And that happened throughout the whole war. We did that, and that was known as over the hump, flying over the Himalayas, which is kind of a cool thing. So here's the Japanese extent of their conquest, that red line. We'd call this the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is total baloney, but that's what they call it. So if you look here, here's Hawaii. And, first of all, this is about 2,000 miles away, give or take. So they never expected anyone to attack Hawaii undetected, right? But if you look right here in New Guinea, this little section of New Guinea right down here at the bottom is all that remains before the Chinese can then launch an attack on Australia. Australia is the British base of operations. They've lost Hong Kong. They have Singapore, but it's falling, as we speak, so to speak. And if they lose that, the only place left in Asia is India. If we lose Australia, that pretty much takes Japan off our able to get to, so to speak, off our radar. So I'll mention here's the Philippines. We had a 4-star general, the highest general in America at the time, who was in command of the Philippines, was named Douglas MacArthur. And they were cut off. There was no way to get supplies or reinforcements or anything to them. And our soldiers there in the Philippines and our Filipino friends were stuck eating their dead horses. They're eating shoe leather and belts. They're starving and they're stuck. They're stuck in a fortress. We're going to sneak a mini sub into the harbor in Manila and rescue Douglas MacArthur. So that will actually pull MacArthur out using a submarine. President Roosevelt could not allow America's greatest general to be captured, in battle. But unfortunately, it means the base falls. Now, the base had held out since December. You know, the Philippines get attacked at the same time that Pearl Harbor does, and they fought for 4 brutal months. And in the end, they had to surrender. They didn't have any food, and they're dying. MacArthur, on his way out in typical MacArthur showboat form. Now, MacArthur was a great general, but he was also a showboat, a prima donna. He said, "People of the Philippines, I shall return. I'm coming back." Right? And then he got in the sub and left. Guys, the soldiers are like, "You saw, but it made sense. We don't want to lose our brilliant commander in the first battles of the war." Now, one of the things your book doesn't talk about, or if it does, I don't remember it talking about it, is that the Japanese are an absolutely ruthless enemy. This is one of to this day, I have a hard time being like nice to not to Japanese Americans or Japanese people, but sympathetic of Japanese people in history. And the reason it is because they were signatories. They had signed agreements that said, we will not engage in inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. Right? These are known in history as the Geneva Convention. So you need to know these meetings. They're held semi every couple 40 years in Geneva, and they come up with the rules of war, like not chemical weapons on civilians and things like that. And, I think about it, even to this day, I'll draw this because you guys might recognize it. You guys recognize this? Okay. Sorry. That's a Mitsubishi symbol. You guys ever heard of Mitsubishi? Mitsubishi was the company, the Zaibatsu, which is a corporation that made the Japanese Zeros that attacked us at Pearl Harbor. So, I've had a personal reason. I will not own a Mitsubishi for any other reason. It's just too much connected to that event in history. But at the same time, the modern Japanese are not those Japanese. But they had this agreement to not torture and hurt POWs. And one British prisoner was, the officers were supposed to be separated from their men and, allowed certain treatment. And the men, so anyway, they had rules to how to govern prisoners. And this British officer went to this Japanese POW commander and said, he took out his copy of the Geneva Convention, part of his kit. And he said, you're violating the Geneva Convention. Kind of held it like that. And the Japanese officer took the Geneva Convention and slapped him in the face with it. Could care less. He said, because these are people who surrendered. And they utterly violated the Geneva Convention numerous times, but by far the worst time was the Bataan Death March. Now they're going to later in history lock up people and set them on fire and do things like that too. They've already done terrible torture things to the Chinese people, which they still don't really admit to doing. But this event in history is called the Bataan Death March. So Bataan is a camp in the Philippines where our soldiers and British soldiers and Filipino soldiers are going to be forced to march in the heat of the Philippines without food or water to this camp, to this prison camp. And thousands of them are going to fall out. Hundreds are going to die. People are going to be bayoneted, and people are going to be starved later. And so the Japanese just had no sympathy, no decency when it came to how they treated our soldiers, or the Brits in the Asian theater. And so, when we get into the debate about using the atom bomb or not, I'm not too sympathetic. I don't have this. This is a people that by the way, American POWs, and there were times of atrocities. Don't get me wrong. There were Americans who did things wrong. But if you were a German or a Japanese person captured in battle, you went to places like Iowa and Pennsylvania, and then you became later after the war an American, and you loved it. Like most of them, when given the choice to go back home, they're like, "Nah, we're good here." So the Germans were okay to the American POWs; they weren't terrible. Keep in mind, the Germans were also doing what they were doing to the Jews, so I wouldn't feel too good about that either. But the Japanese were absolutely brutal, and so this is a war that's going to really be ugly when it comes to particularly treatment prisoners. So, yeah, Iowa is a tough trade-off for Bataan for sure. So again, I want to focus down here geographically. So you can see that the Pacific has become the Japanese sort of playground, right? The coast of Asia. By this point, by 42, they've taken over Indochina, Burma. So they're knocking on the door of India. Got that? And Australia. So this is why we are going to have to get involved in the Pacific, whether or not we want to get Hitler first or not. If Australia falls, the whole game is over. So we're going to have our very first battle of the war in the Pacific, the first major battle. Now, some students and historians will argue this is the most important key turning point battle. I disagree. I think the next battle is the most important, but this is the first major important battle. And it's called the Battle of Coral Sea. Okay. The Battle of Coral Sea. And this battle is going to stop the advance of the Japanese. So if you can look right here, see where it says New Guinea? See, we can't land ground forces in Australia till we control the Japanese Navy. And the Japanese Navy controls the straits through these islands. And here's Australia right here. So we're going to have a major engagement. And in the end, you're going to see an American aircraft carrier, the Lexington, sinking, right? You're also going to see a Japanese aircraft carrier sinking and another Japanese aircraft carrier sinking. So we win the Battle of the Coral Sea. What's interesting to me about this battle in history, it's the first naval battle ever fought where ships don't fight each other. So it's a naval battle fought entirely by airplanes. So those ships are sinking because airplanes bombed them. So this is a battle of aircraft carriers, right? And we win. Now it's not a rout. It's not like we utterly devastate them, but we stop them from advancing. And so the Battle of Coral Sea, and if you're into naval warfare history, this is a really neat one to study. Under the leadership of Chester Nimitz, is going to be a first victory of the war, and that's an important one. So you see, it's in the summer of 42, right, or late spring of 42, and then will come in the summer, the next month, the sort of enormous blow to the Pacific, to the Japanese. So the battle that you got a superstar know is the Battle of Midway. So the Japanese felt the Battle of Coral Sea, don't get me wrong, because it stopped their advance on Australia. So what they decided to do was to take another attack and this time destroy any way America could have refueling. So if you try to think of it as like a line, y'all, the line that goes like Hawaii to Japan, you can't go directly from Hawaii to Japan. You got to stop at the ships. You have to stop and then be refueled. And the fuel at that time in history was coal. So the most obvious place for refueling for coal was on the island of Midway. And so here's the island of Midway, which is located conveniently enough midway across the Pacific, right? Thus the name. So this time we used our naval intelligence better. Last time they didn't predict it would come at Pearl Harbor. This time you had a naval officer who predicted that the next attack would come at Midway. And Admiral Nimitz said, okay, and Admiral Halsey said, okay, so let's figure it out. The problem was, where was the attack going to come from in the Pacific, right? So, by the way, if you're ever curious, up here at the top, these are the only two pieces of actual American territory that was like part of our country that was occupied by the Japanese. It's two little islands that were unoccupied by humans called Attu and Kisku, way up here at the top. Attu and Kiska, they're in the Aleutians. See them right up there, little tiny ones. So that's as far as they got to occupying like American soil, so to speak. But the attack was enormous. You can see here it is 5 aircraft carrier groups. So an aircraft carrier is a mammoth ship, right? And they're steaming towards Midway, and our planes are up flying around looking for them. And if you fly out over the Pacific, it's a huge body of water. You're not necessarily going to find any of them. So they know it's coming, but they don't know where. And one of the planes is coming back, and the sun is setting. So it's in your eyes if you're sailing west. If you're flying westward, the sun went up. And he sees something other than water glinting off the surface. And he looks down, and it's the Japanese assembled fleet. It's like a whole fleet. So he radios back, and it's like, dudes, I spotted them. They spot him, right? So they start fueling their planes. But by the time they're fueling their planes, our wave of guys come in. So imagine it's just gas all over the deck of the ships, right? The gas lines being put in the planes. And we're bombing those gas. We're like bombing the surfaces of them. We annihilate the Pacific fleet. We sink 3 aircraft carriers in this battle. All right. They sink 1 American carrier, but they lose the bulk of their Pacific fleet. You understand? And they have to sail back. Now, one of the things that's been up for controversy lately that I've picked up on is apparently Dr. Seuss's estate, the group that manages his books, took some of his books out of circulation. And if you go back there, you'll see Dr. Seuss Goes to War. You see that? It's laying flat, I think, now. But it's an entire collection of cartoons of Dr. Seuss when he. So you guys probably read books of Dr. Seuss, right? So this is an entire book of his World War II era cartoons. It's cool, ain't it? Yeah, I'll leave it to you guys to look at. But right here it is, folks at home. You know, collection of Dr. Seuss Goes to War. Really fun little book. Dr. Seuss was a great cartoonist. I love his stuff, love his lessons. But, you know, if you take a look at this picture of the Japanese, not that cool. Like, you're not supposed to depict Japanese like that anymore, right? But, you know, this is the Midway tide stick slapping Tojo in the head, right? So the tide has turned, and that's Dr. Seuss's signature. So lots of cartoons during this period, sort of anti-militarist, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi. So please put a big star beside Midway. And, you know, I would definitely know Coral Sea, but I would know Midway even more. That means we can now start landing troops in the Pacific. Okay. And what our commander is, and the name of our commander is General Douglas MacArthur. He will be promoted, as will General Marshall, to 5 stars. It's the only time in American history we've had 5-star generals. You know. So he'll be promoted to a 5-star general. And he is our commander of the sort of joint forces, Marines and Army, in the Pacific Theater. Navy has their own commanders. Okay. And they're going to return to the Philippines. But before that, we have to get a foothold from Australia. So what we decide to do here is a strategy that is known in history as island hopping, right? Island hopping. So here is the Solomon Islands, way down here in the bottom. It's like barely the sea. Right? Tiny little islands down here, the Solomons, they're called. And here's Australia, Solomons, Australia. And so we're going to, after Coral Sea and Midway, we're going to land our first in-ground troops in the Solomons. And our objective is called island hopping, which is to not fight them everywhere they are, right? But to rather take islands that are useful as air bases. So they're like unsinkable battleships. You get here, it's an island. And then if the Japanese are on an island that doesn't have an airstrip worth anything, then leave that one alone. Just go around it or over it, so to speak. And then they won't be able to get resupplied. So like 20 years later, there's still going to be Japanese dudes on some of these islands ready to fight the war somewhere. You know, so you skip over them, you hop over them. You got it? That's island hopping. And this is going to be very effective. And our first major battle is called Guadalcanal. So it's a battle in the Solomons. And, you know, this is the first time American ground troops are going to engage the Japanese directly. And it is a bloodbath, an absolute massacre. Our troops are very effectively trained. What's amazing about how well our troops and soldiers operate is they are strong. So to have been such a new army, highly disciplined. Okay. And so they're going to take up positions along rivers and things like that. And the Japanese are going to charge them. They call them the bonsai charge. You know, these Japanese would run across, and we've got, you know, 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns and 50 cal machine guns. And so they're going to run into a massive assault and get slaughtered. The Japanese just get mowed down. You can see they suffer 20,000 casualties to America's 1,700. But they won't surrender. Like they're running through blood and guts, and it's just absolutely terrible. And they just keep coming. And Americans who I've read about this are like, were just astonished at the sort of fearlessness of it. You know, like you're shooting with a machine gun, and these guys are just running into it like mosquitoes. You know, but the good story is that that doesn't win. That's not going to work against disciplined American troops with sound positioning who stop them. And so the Battle of Guadalcanal will be the sort of moment when the Japanese ground forces, combined with Midway, stop moving forward. And from the rest of the war, 42 on, the Japanese will be retreating. We'll be pushing them backwards, okay? So I'm going to stop with Japan today, and tomorrow we'll pick up with Europe. And hopefully that is clear to some of you what all that stuff meant. So any questions?